I told my therapist I was doing better so she'd be proud of me. I was not doing better. The hospital bracelet cut into my wrist when I tried to stand, and that's when I realized I wasn't in my apartment anymore. The fluorescent lights burned white against industrial ceiling tiles. A nurse I'd never seen before was checking my IV line with the kind of careful precision that told me this wasn't my first trip to this room. Dr. Eleanor Brennan, my therapist of 8 months, sat in the corner chair with my journal open on her lap, and the look on her face wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something worse: recognition. She'd finally seen what I'd been hiding, and the careful mask I'd built across 23 sessions had shattered somewhere between the empty pill bottle on my bathroom floor and the ambulance ride I didn't remember taking. My brother Danny sat against the wall with his head in his hands, and I knew from the way his shoulders shook that he'd been the one to find me. I'd started therapy in March after my girlfriend left and took the dog. That sounds like the setup to a joke, but it wasn't funny when you come home to empty closets and a note that says, "I can't watch you disappear anymore." I was 29, working as a software developer for a consulting firm, living alone in a studio apartment in Portland, and I genuinely thought I was fine. My manager, Kevin Liu, had suggested the therapy after I missed 3 client meetings in 2 weeks. The company insurance covered 12 sessions with Dr. Brennan, a licensed clinical psychologist with 14 years of experience in cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma. She had certificates on her wall from Johns Hopkins and a framed photo of a golden retriever that made her seem safe. That first session, I told her about the breakup, the insomnia, the way food tasted like cardboard. She asked if I'd had thoughts of self-harm. I said no. That was the first lie, but it felt like kindness, like I was saving her from the weight of my actual thoughts. The truth is, I'd been planning it since January, 2 months before the breakup. I had a document on my laptop titled Server Migration Notes that was actually a detailed timeline of prescription accumulation, dosage calculations, and timing strategies. I researched which medications were hardest to reverse, which combinations overwhelmed the liver fastest, how long before someone would think to check on me. I spread out the prescriptions across 3 different doctors. My primary care physician, Dr. Nathan Ford, for sleep aids, a walk-in clinic for anxiety medication, an online psychiatrist service for antidepressants so no single person would see the full picture. I told Dr. Brennan I was sleeping better when I was actually stockpiling Ambien. I told her my appetite was returning when I'd lost another 9 pounds. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m., I sat in her office with its cream-colored walls and potted fern and lied about my progress because I needed her to believe I was getting better. I needed someone to believe that version of me existed, even if it didn't. The escalation happened in layers I barely noticed myself. By April, I was working from home full-time because I couldn't make myself shower or change clothes. I told Dr. Brennan I'd requested remote work for better work-life balance. She smiled and called it a healthy boundary. In May, I stopped answering my brother's calls and texts. Danny lived 4 hours away in Seattle with his wife Claire and their twin daughters, and he'd call every Sunday morning like clockwork. I let them go to voicemail and sent brief texts. Busy with work, all good, talk soon. Dr. Brennan asked about my support system. I said my family was doing great and we talked regularly. The lie came out smooth as water. In June, I closed my bank account and moved everything to cash because I didn't want anyone tracing purchases or finding patterns after. I told Dr. Brennan I was budgeting better and felt more in control of my finances. She noted it as progress in her little leather journal. Meanwhile, I'd stopped paying rent and my landlord had started leaving notices on my door. The first crack appeared in early July when my coworker Ashley Chen called Dr. Brennan's emergency line after I didn't show up for a critical client presentation. I'd been copied on the emails, had the calendar invite, just didn't go. Ashley had picked up lunch for me twice that week because I'd mentioned being too busy to eat, and when I went completely dark on the day of the presentation, she panicked. Dr. Brennan called me that afternoon. I was lying on my apartment floor counting pills into bottles, sorting them by type and effectiveness, and her name lit up my phone screen like an alarm. I answered and told her I'd had a migraine, had forgotten to call in sick, was embarrassed, but fine. My voice was steady. I'd practiced being steady. She asked if I wanted to schedule an extra session. I said I didn't want to be a burden. She said I wasn't. I said I'd see her next Tuesday. I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice, but I crushed it with reassurance. I'm actually feeling really good lately, I told her. The medication adjustments are really helping. She didn't know there were no medication adjustments. There was only accumulation. Dr. Brennan started pushing harder in our sessions. She'd ask about specific details. What I ate for breakfast, what time I went to bed, whether I'd talked to anyone that week. I got better at lying. I created entire fictional days, coffee with a friend named Tom from college who didn't exist, a hiking trip to Silver Falls that never happened, a phone call with my mom who'd been dead for 6 years. I described the weather on these fake days, the conversations we'd had, the way I'd felt afterward. Dr. Brennan would nod and take notes, and I'd watch her pen move across the page, recording my fabricated recovery. Sometimes I'd catch her studying my face like she was looking for something, and I'd smile and crack a joke about work stress or Portland traffic. The performance was exhausting, but it felt necessary. I needed her last image of me to be someone who'd tried, someone who'd been getting better, someone worth the effort she'd put in. I needed her to not feel like she'd failed, because in my mind, this wasn't her failure. It was my mercy. Everything collapsed on a Saturday night in late July. I'd taken the first round of pills around 8 p.m. 30. Ambien dissolved into applesauce to mask the taste, and was working through the secondary medications when Danny kicked in my apartment door. He'd driven down from Seattle after Claire found a goodbye email I'd scheduled to send Monday morning, but Gmail had glitched and delivered it early. The email was clinical, apologetic, specific about my storage unit key location and which accounts to close first. Danny found me conscious but fading on the bathroom floor with my detailed plan printed out beside me. Pill bottles arranged in order of consumption, a glass of water, and my phone playing a Spotify playlist I'd titled Background Noise. He called 911 while performing CPR he'd learned for his daughters, screaming at me to stay awake, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that he had to be the one to find me. That wasn't part of the plan. The paramedics, Luis Ortega and Janice Kim, according to the report I'd read later, arrived within 6 minutes and administered activated charcoal and IV fluids. I coded once in the ambulance. They brought me back. Dr. Brennan appeared at the hospital on Sunday morning with my therapy file and a legal pad covered in notes. Danny had called her emergency line from my phone contacts, and she'd spent the previous night reviewing 8 months of session recordings and her own documentation. She'd brought in Dr. Raymond Foster, the hospital's psychiatric consultant with 22 years specializing in suicidal ideation and intervention, and together they'd reconstructed the timeline of my deception. Dr. Brennan told me later that the sophistication of my lying had actually alarmed them more than the attempt itself. The level of planning and performance suggested a deeply entrenched desire to die, not an impulsive crisis. They found the server migration document on my laptop, the prescription bottles from multiple providers, the scheduled emails, the closed bank account. Dr. Foster sat beside my bed and asked me questions with the kind of directness I'd never heard from a medical professional. Did you want to die, or did you want the pain to stop? When you lied to Dr. Brennan, were you protecting her or protecting your plan? Do you understand that you taught yourself to be convincing about recovery while actively engineering your death? I answered honestly for the first time in months. Yes. Both. Yes. The psychiatric hold lasted 72 hours initially, then extended to 14 days under Oregon's involuntary commitment laws after Dr. Foster determined I remained a danger to myself. They moved me to the behavioral health unit on the 3rd floor, or locked doors, observation windows, roommate checks every 15 minutes. Dr. Brennan visited 3 times that first week, not as my therapist anymore, but as someone trying to understand where she'd missed the signs. She brought the journal where I'd lied about hiking trips and friend meetups, and we went through it page by page. I showed her how I'd researched believable details, how I'd varied my fake activities to seem naturally random, how I'd intentionally shown small improvements followed by minor setbacks to create a realistic recovery trajectory. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that cracked through my numbness. You put more effort into convincing me you wanted to live than most people put into actual living. She wasn't angry. She was devastated. And somehow, that was worse than any punishment I'd imagined. The real recovery, started with brutal honesty in group therapy sessions led by Dr. Angela Reeves, a psychiatric nurse practitioner with 16 years in crisis intervention. There were 8 of us in the Tuesday morning group, both ages ranging from 19 to 61, all voluntary or involuntary holds, all wrestling with versions of the same darkness. I told them about the spreadsheet, the multiple doctors, the performance I'd given Dr. Brennan. A woman named Bethany, who'd survived 3 attempts, said, "The energy you spent on that plan could have built a whole different life." She wasn't wrong. Dr. Reeves introduced me to dialectical behavior therapy and the concept that I could hold 2 truths simultaneously. I'd wanted to die, and I was glad I'd survived. We practiced distress tolerance skills, emotional regulation, radical acceptance of the present moment. My brother Danny attended the family therapy sessions every Thursday, driving down from Seattle and sleeping in his car in the hospital parking lot because he was afraid to leave. He told me he'd been worried since January, had called Dr. Brennan twice to express concern, but had believed my reassurances because he'd wanted to believe them. The guilt in his voice mirrored my own. By the 4th week, they transferred me to a residential treatment program in Beaverton Forest Grove Behavioral Health, a 30-day intensive program that looked like a college dormitory but functioned like structured recovery boot camp. I had a roommate named Jordan who played guitar at 2 a.m. and talked about his kids like they were the only reason his heart kept beating. We ate meals together in a cafeteria with plastic utensils and participated in 8 hours of therapy daily, few individual, group, art, movement, cognitive processing. Dr. Brennan referred me to Dr. Isaac Thompson, a psychiatrist specializing in treatment-resistant depression and complex trauma, who actually listened when I described the feeling of watching my life from outside my body. He prescribed a combination of medications I'd never tried and explained that my previous antidepressants had been inadequate for major depressive disorder with psychotic features. A diagnosis no one had caught because I'd been too functional at lying. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been so good at pretending to be okay that I'd hidden symptoms of a treatable condition. The turning point came during a family session in week 3 when Danny read a letter he'd written to me. His voice shook as he described finding me on the bathroom floor, the sound I'd made when I'd stopped breathing, the way the paramedics had looked at each other when my heart monitor went flat. He talked about explaining to his 6-year-old daughters why Uncle Jason was in the hospital, the nightmares he'd been having, the fear that dominated every phone call that went to voicemail. "You thought you were sparing us," he said, "but you almost destroyed us." Claire sat beside him crying, and I realized that my careful plan had accounted for everything except the people who would have found me afterward. Dr. Reeves, who sat in on the session, asked what I would say to my brother now. I told him the truth. I'd been so far inside my own pain that I couldn't see his. I'd convinced myself that my death would be a relief, a problem solved, a burden lifted. The fantasy of my suicide had been peaceful and clinical. The reality was violent and shattering. I apologized, though the word felt microscopically small against the damage. Dr. Thompson adjusted my medications 3 times before we found a combination that didn't numb me, but lifted the fog enough to function. The suicidal ideation didn't vanish immediately. It faded in increments, like someone slowly turning up lights in a dark room. I started noticing small things, the way morning light hit the windows in the common area, the taste of actual food, the sound of Jordan's guitar that had annoyed me becoming something I looked forward to. Dr. Brennan visited once during the residential stay, not as my therapist, but as closure for both of us. She brought letters from Ashley Chen and Kevin Liu, my coworkers who'd been terrified when they heard. Ashley's letter said she'd suspected something was wrong, but didn't know how to push without seeming intrusive. Kevin said the company wanted me back when I was ready and had extended my health insurance indefinitely. Dr. Brennan and I talked about the therapeutic relationship, about trust and deception, about the responsibility I'd placed on her to save me while actively preventing her from doing so. She said she'd be reviewing her intake protocols and assessment tools because of me. I'd become a case study in high-functioning suicidal presentation. The thought should have felt shameful. Instead, it felt like something useful might come from the wreckage. I completed the 30-day program and transitioned to intensive outpatient therapy. 3 evenings per week, 3 hours per session, for 8 weeks. Dr. Thompson continued as my psychiatrist, meeting monthly to monitor medication and discuss persistent symptoms. The suicidal thoughts came less frequently, and when they appeared, I had tools to interrupt them, calling Danny, texting my outpatient group, using the safety plan we'd developed that included crisis hotline numbers and coping strategies. I started attending a peer support group for suicide attempt survivors that met Wednesday nights at a community center. The facilitator, Marcasa, who'd survived an attempt 12 years prior and now worked as a crisis counselor, ran the meetings with brutal honesty and dark humor that made the horror of our shared experiences somehow more bearable. We talked about the aftermath, the medications, the relationships we'd damaged, the trust we were rebuilding. One guy named Steven said his therapist had told him, "Recovery isn't linear," and we all laughed because we'd heard that exact phrase at least 50 times. But it was true. Some days I woke up okay. Some days I woke up fighting. I returned to work in October on a modified schedule, 20 hours per week, fully remote, with weekly check-ins with Kevin Liu and the HR representative Janet Kowalski, who specialized in disability accommodations and medical leave coordination. My first project back was low-stakes database maintenance, nothing client-facing, nothing deadline-driven. Ashley Chen sent me Slack messages with dog photos and stupid memes, never asking how I was doing but making her presence steady and light. I told Kevin about the therapy, the diagnosis, the medications, not everything, but enough that he understood I was managing a chronic condition. He thanked me for my honesty and said the company's mental health benefits included continued therapy coverage and access to an employee assistance program. The relief of not hiding felt extraordinary. I'd spent so much energy maintaining the performance of functionality that actual functionality, even reduced functionality, felt easier by comparison. I wasn't great, but I was real, and real turned out to be survivable. Danny and Claire invited me to Seattle for Thanksgiving, and I went despite the anxiety that crowded my chest during the entire 4-hour drive. Their daughters, Emma and Sophia, were 7 now, and treated me with the cautious kindness of children who'd been told Uncle Jason had been very sick. We made cookies shaped like turkeys, watched animated movies, played board games that Emma cheated at shamelessly. Danny and I took a walk around their neighborhood one evening, and he asked how I was actually doing. I told him about the medications, the therapy schedule, the peer support group, the way some mornings I still had to talk myself through getting out of bed. He listened without trying to fix anything, and when I finished, he said, "I'm glad you're still here." Simple as that. Not, "I'm glad you're better," or "I'm glad it's over." Just glad I was here. Present tense. Ongoing. That night, I lay on their guest room bed and thought about the spreadsheet I'd built, the timeline I'd constructed, the ending I'd planned. The life I was living now wasn't the one I'd imagined back in March. It was smaller, harder, more uncertain, but it was real. And somewhere in the gap between the fantasy of my death and the reality of my survival, I'd found something worth protecting. 6 months after the attempt, I met with Dr. Brennan one final time at a coffee shop near her office. She'd stopped practicing therapy temporarily to pursue additional training in suicide assessment and intervention. My case had shaken her more than she'd admitted initially. We talked about the sessions where I'd lied, the signs she'd missed, the things she might do differently now. She asked if I was angry that she hadn't caught it. I told her the truth. I'd been trying not to get caught. I'd researched how therapists identified suicidal ideation and had specifically avoided those patterns. I'd studied the assessment questionnaires online and knew which answers would trigger concern. The deception had been sophisticated because I'd made it sophisticated. She wasn't responsible for my lies. I was. She cried a little, and I realized I'd never seen her cry before. She asked what I wanted people to know if I ever told this story. I said I wanted them to know that doing better doesn't always mean recovering. Sometimes it means getting better at hiding. That the people who seem most functional might be the ones closest to the edge. That asking someone if they're okay isn't enough if they've learned to lie convincingly. That recovery is possible, but it starts with the brutal, terrifying step of telling the truth. She wrote it down in her journal, same leather journal, same careful handwriting. But this time, I wasn't lying. This time, the progress was real. I still see Dr. Thompson monthly and attend the peer support group on Wednesdays. The medications help, but don't erase everything. Some days are still heavy, still gray, still require conscious effort to stay present. I've learned to measure recovery in small increments, answering Danny's calls consistently, showing up for work, eating meals, taking walks, sleeping through the night without nightmares of the bathroom floor. Jordan from the residential program texts me occasionally with photos of his kids and updates on his own recovery. Ashley Chen and I got coffee last month, and I told her about the email I'd scheduled, about how her call to Dr. Brennan had been one of the first threads that unraveled my plan. She said she'd known something was wrong, but hadn't trusted her instincts enough to push harder. I told her that wasn't her responsibility, that I'd actively worked to hide it, that she'd done more than most people would. We sat in silence for a while after that, both of us holding the weight of what almost happened. Eventually she asked if I'd gotten another dog. I said no, not yet, but maybe someday. The fact that someday existed as a concept felt like progress. The therapist I see now, Dr. Michael Park, a clinical psychologist with 11 years specializing in post-suicide attempt recovery, knows the entire history. He has copies of Dr. Brennan's notes, the hospital records, the residential treatment discharge summary. I don't have to perform for him because the worst is already documented. We work on building tolerance for uncertainty, practicing self-compassion, identifying thought patterns that spiral toward crisis. He asks hard questions about what I was seeking in suicide. Was it the end of consciousness or the end of pain? Was I running from something or toward something? The answers change depending on the day, but the honesty stays constant. Last week he asked if I ever think about trying again. I said yes, sometimes. Usually when I'm tired or overwhelmed or the medications feel ineffective. He asked what I do when those thoughts appear. I said I call Danny or text the peer support group or watch stupid videos until the moment passes. He asked if I trust myself to keep doing that. I said I'm building that trust day by day. He nodded. That's the work, he said. Not recovery as destination. Recovery as ongoing practice. Recovery as choice made repeatedly, hour by hour, day by accumulating day. I tell this story not because it has a neat resolution, but because it doesn't. I'm not fixed. I'm not cured. I'm managing a chronic condition that requires daily attention, professional support, medication, honesty, and the humbling acceptance that some days will be harder than others. The version of me that sat in Dr. Brennan's office lying about hiking trips and friend meetups. That person was trying to disappear gracefully, trying to make my death easy for everyone else to process. The version of me that exists now understands that there's no graceful way to die by suicide. There's only violence and aftermath and the people left behind trying to make sense of preventable loss. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in the performance I described earlier, if you're lying to your therapist, your family, your friends about how you're really doing, I'm asking you to stop. Not because honesty is easy or comfortable, but because the alternative is final. The spreadsheet I built, the plan I constructed, the ending I engineered, none of it accounted for the possibility that life could become bearable again. That I might want to meet Danny's daughters when they're older, that I might taste food that doesn't taste like cardboard, that I might care about stupid small things like Jordan's guitar or Ashley's dog photos or the way morning light looks different in January than July. Those weren't reasons to live back in March. They're not grand enough, not meaningful enough. But they've accumulated into something that resembles a life. Smaller than I'd imagined, harder than I'd hoped, but real. And real, I've learned, is enough to build on. The truth is, I'm still here. Some days, that feels like victory. Some days, it just feels like survival. Most days, it's enough that I can't tell the difference anymore. What I didn't mention about the residential program was the art therapy component led by Rebecca Donovan, a licensed creative arts therapist with 13 years working in psychiatric facilities. Every Monday and Friday afternoon, we'd sit in a bright room with art supplies and instructions to express what words can't reach. I thought it was performative nonsense at first, the kind of therapeutic theater that looks good in brochures but accomplishes nothing. Then Rebecca handed me charcoal and paper and said, "Draw what the bathroom floor looked like." I drew for 90 minutes straight. Dark smears, pill bottles rendered in harsh angles, my brother's face distorted by panic, the fluorescent hospital lights like interrogation beams. When I finished, my hands were black with charcoal and I was crying for the first time since the attempt. Rebecca didn't interpret it or assign meaning. She just said, That's what happened. Now it's outside you. The drawing stayed on the wall for the rest of my stay, and other patients would stop and look at it. Jordan told me it helped him articulate his own attempt, the way trauma lives in images before it becomes words. I still have a photo of that drawing on my phone. Sometimes, when the ideation creeps back, I look at it and remember that the worst moment of my life is already documented. I survived it once. The image proves it. The medication journey with Dr. Thompson was more complex than I'd anticipated. The first combination, an SSRI, and an atypical antipsychotic, made me sleep 16 hours a day and gave me tremors that made typing impossible. The second attempt added a mood stabilizer that caused weight gain and cognitive fog so thick I couldn't follow conversations. Dr. Thompson explained that treatment-resistant depression often required trial and error, that my brain chemistry was unique, that we'd find something that worked. His patience was extraordinary. During one appointment in November, I broke down and told him I'd rather feel suicidal than feel nothing at all, that the numbness was its own kind of death. He didn't dismiss it. He said, "That's valuable data. We're not looking for numbness. We're looking for enough space between you and the pain that you can function." The third combination, a different SSRI, low-dose lithium, and an ADHD medication that helped with the cognitive symptoms, finally created that space. Not happiness, not joy. Just enough distance from the edge that I could build something resembling a life. The medication log I kept for Dr. Thompson looked like a science experiment. Dosages, side effects, mood ratings on a scale of 1 to 10, sleep quality, appetite changes. It was clinical and obsessive, but it gave me control over something. If I couldn't control my brain chemistry directly, I could at least document its behavior and help Dr. Thompson make informed decisions. The peer support group became more important than I expected. Marcus, the facilitator, ran the Wednesday sessions with a structure that balanced sharing and education. We'd start with check-ins, everyone stating their name and how many days since their attempt or last serious ideation. Then we'd tackle a specific topic: managing triggers, rebuilding trust, navigating relationships post-attempt, dealing with hospitalization trauma, medication experiences. The group was diverse. Stephen worked construction and had survived a hanging attempt. Linda was a retired teacher who'd overdosed after her husband died. Carlos was 19 and had jumped from a bridge. Bethany was on her 4th year of recovery after 3 attempts. We shared strategies that actually worked. Carlos taught me to text him when I felt the pull toward planning. Linda introduced me to grounding techniques that used sensory details to interrupt spiraling thoughts. Stephen talked about the importance of routine even when routine felt meaningless. The dark humor in those sessions was therapeutic in ways traditional therapy wasn't. We could joke about psych ward food, medication side effects, the awkwardness of telling new people about our attempts. The laughter wasn't dismissive, it was survival. It was reclaiming our stories from tragedy and making them bearable. Marcus always ended sessions by asking, "What's one reason you're glad you're here tonight?" The answers ranged from profound to mundane. "My daughter's birthday is next month. I want to see how this TV series ends. I'm curious what happens next." Mine was usually simple. I want to see if tomorrow is different. And most days, it was. Incrementally, almost imperceptibly, but different. The work reintegration was harder than the therapeutic work in some ways. Kevin Liu, my manager, had been supportive during my leave, but returning to the office dynamics, even remotely, required navigating questions I didn't know how to answer. Co-workers who knew I'd been on medical leave would ask vaguely about my health, and I'd give vague responses about managing a chronic condition. Ashley Chen was the only colleague who knew the full story, and she became a buffer between me and curious questions. She'd redirect conversations, change subjects, protect my privacy without making it obvious. During team meetings, she'd notice when I was struggling to focus and would follow up afterward with meeting notes and action items. The work itself became therapeutic. There was something grounding about solving technical problems with clear solutions. Code either worked or it didn't. Databases either queried correctly or threw errors. The binary nature of programming was comforting after months of navigating the gray areas of mental health. By December, Kevin increased my hours to 30 per week, and assigned me to a long-term project with manageable deadlines. The client, a healthcare analytics company called Med Data Solutions, was building a patient record system, and the irony of working on medical software while recovering from a suicide attempt wasn't lost on me. But the work was engaging, and engagement was a form of healing I hadn't anticipated. Danny started calling every Sunday morning again, but the conversations were different now. He'd ask specific questions. Did you take your medication today? When's your next appointment with Dr. Thompson? Have you eaten anything besides cereal? The questions annoyed me at first. I was 29, not a child who needed monitoring. But Claire explained during one family therapy session that the specificity was how Danny managed his own anxiety. He couldn't unsee me on that bathroom floor, couldn't unhear the sound of my heart stopping. The detailed questions gave him something concrete to hold on to, evidence that I was still here, still functioning, still trying. So I started answering honestly. Yes, this morning with breakfast. Friday at 2 p.m. I made pasta last night and there's leftovers. Small confirmations of continued existence. We talked about other things too, his daughter's school projects, Claire's promotion at work, the house repairs they were planning. Normal family stuff that felt extraordinary because I was alive to hear about it. In January, Danny asked if I'd be the girls' emergency contact for school. It was a small thing, but it meant he trusted me to be stable enough, present enough, to handle a crisis if one arose. I said yes and cried after we hung up, not from sadness. From the weight of being trusted again after proving myself untrustworthy with my own life. Dr. Park introduced me to something called radical acceptance during our sessions. The idea that I could acknowledge my desire to die without acting on it, that I could hold the thought without letting it control me. We practiced it during sessions. I'm having the thought that I want to die. That's a thought, not a command. I can notice it and let it pass. It sounded like spiritual nonsense when he first explained it, but the practice was surprisingly effective. When the ideation appeared, usually around 3 a.m., when my medication wore thin and sleep was elusive, I'd lie in bed and narrate the experience. I'm having suicidal thoughts. This is a symptom of my depression. This will pass. I've survived this before. The detachment didn't eliminate the pain, but it created enough separation that I could wait it out instead of spiraling into planning. Dr. Park also introduced exposure work, intentionally engaging with the memories of the attempt instead of avoiding them. We started small, talking about the bathroom floor without dissociating, describing the hospital without panic, looking at photos from the residential program. Eventually, we worked up to visiting the apartment building where I'd lived during the attempt. I hadn't been back since the hospitalization. My brother had packed my belongings and moved them to a storage unit while I was in treatment. Standing outside that building in February, looking up at the third-floor window where I'd planned to die, was surreal. The building looked smaller than I remembered. Ordinary. Just another Portland apartment complex with a broken gate and a recycling bin overflow. Dr. Park stood beside me and asked what I was feeling. I said, "It feels like it happened to someone else." He said, "That's dissociation. Can you stay present with it?" I tried. Felt the cold air on my face, the traffic noise, the weight of my body existing in space. I didn't die here. I almost died here. Both things were true. We stood there for 10 minutes, then left. That night, I slept 6 hours straight. The longest stretch since the attempt. The financial aftermath was another layer of recovery no one had prepared me for. The hospitalization, residential treatment, and ongoing therapy had generated over $80,000 in medical bills, even with insurance coverage. Janet Kowalski from HR helped me navigate the company's catastrophic medical expense policy and file for short-term disability back pay, which covered about 40% of the costs. The rest went to payment plans, medical debt negotiation, and a medical bankruptcy consultation with attorney David Sullivan, who specialized in healthcare financial navigation. David told me that medical bankruptcy was common, not shameful, and that my credit would recover faster than I'd expect. The paperwork was Byzantine Abrur billing statements from multiple providers, insurance explanations of benefits, coordination of benefits forms, appeals for denied claims. I spent hours on the phone with insurance representatives, explaining the same situation repeatedly. Yes, it was a suicide attempt. Yes, it was medically necessary. Yes, I had pre-authorized the residential stay. Some representatives were sympathetic. Others were bureaucratically cold. The worst was a billing agent from the hospital who asked why I'd chosen such an expensive treatment method. I hung up and called Danny, who spent 30 minutes talking me down from the rage. The financial stress was its own trigger for suicidal thoughts. The irony that surviving had put me in debt made the darkness feel vindicated. Dr. Thompson increased one of my medications temporarily and connected me with a social worker, Patricia Grant, who specialized in medical financial assistance programs. Patricia found grants, sliding scale therapy options, and medication assistance programs I didn't know existed. By March, the debt was manageable, if not resolved. I learned that recovery had a price tag, and sometimes survival meant accepting help you didn't think you deserved. The peer support group had a dropout named Eric, who'd stopped coming in February after 3 years of consistent attendance. Marcus mentioned it casually during check-in. Eric's doing well, doesn't need the group right now, but the absence was loud. Bethany texted me after the session. Eric didn't graduate. He's gone. I didn't understand at first. Then Carlos explained. Eric had completed suicide in his apartment, and his family had notified Marcus. The group was going to his memorial service on Saturday. The news hit me like a physical blow. Eric had been stable, functional, employed, in a relationship. He'd talked about his niece's graduation, about planning a road trip, about feeling the best he'd felt in years. And then, he was gone. The memorial service was brutal. Eric's sister gave a eulogy that described finding him, the note he'd left, the complete absence of warning signs. His therapist spoke about treatment-resistant depression and the statistical reality that not everyone survives long-term. Marcus said, Eric fought hard. Sometimes people fight hard and still lose. That doesn't mean the fight wasn't worth it. Afterward, the remaining group members sat in a diner and talked until midnight. Linda cried and said she was scared. Carlos said he was angry. At the disease, at the statistics, at the unfairness. Stephen said, we keep showing up. That's all we can do. I drove home at 1 a.m. thinking about the spreadsheet I'd built, the plan I'd constructed. Eric had probably built something similar. He'd probably lied convincingly, too. The difference between us was luck and timing. Someone had found me fast enough. The randomness of that truth was terrifying. I called Danny from the car and told him what happened. He listened, then said, I'm glad it wasn't you. I said, me too. And I meant it. The survival guilt was real, but so was the relief. Dr. Thompson added a new therapy modality in April called EMDRI movement desensitization and reprocessing, led by specialist Laura Chen, a licensed clinical psychologist with 9 years focusing on trauma. The technique involved recalling traumatic memories while following a moving light with my eyes, which supposedly helped the brain reprocess trauma. It sounded like pseudoscience, but Dr. Thompson explained the neurological basis and showed me research studies. I was skeptical until the first session. Laura had me focus on the memory of my brother finding me while following a light bar that moved left to right. The memory became vivid. The bathroom tiles, Danny's voice, the taste of charcoal, the paramedic's hands on my chest. But something shifted during the processing. The memory stayed, but the emotional charge diminished. It was still awful, still traumatic, but it didn't hijack my nervous system the way it had before. We did 6 EMDR sessions targeting different aspects of the attempt. The planning phase, the moment of taking the pills, the hospital awakening, the psychiatric hold, the residential program admission. Each session left me exhausted, but lighter. Laura explained that trauma gets stuck in the nervous system, and EMDR helped complete the processing that my brain hadn't finished during the actual events. By May, I could talk about the attempt without my heart rate spiking, without dissociating, without the physical symptoms of panic. The memory existed as history rather than present threat. Dr. Park called it a breakthrough. I called it weird brain science that somehow worked. Work assigned me a new project in May with a tight deadline that would have triggered crisis 6 months earlier. The client was a financial services company needing database optimization for their quarterly reporting system, and they wanted it completed in 8 weeks. Ashley Chen was the other developer on the project, which helped, but the pressure was real. Old patterns started emerging, skipping meals, working 12-hour days, neglecting sleep. Ashley noticed first and called me out directly during a video meeting. "You're doing the thing again," she said. The disappearing thing. I denied it initially, but she shared screenshots of my Slack activity hour online at 2 a.m., messages sent at 5 a.m., 3 days without logging off. She wasn't accusing. She was concerned. "Talk to Kevin," she said, "before this turns into something bigger." I did. Kevin extended the deadline, brought in another developer, and implemented a hard stop on my hour so no work emails after 7 p.m., no weekend work without explicit approval. It felt infantilizing at first, like I was being monitored or restricted. But Dr. Park reframed it. "That's not restriction. That's accommodation. Your brain is recovering from severe trauma. Would you expect someone recovering from a heart attack to run a marathon?" The project finished on time with the extended deadline, and I didn't burn out. The success felt different than previous professional wins. It was success with boundaries, with support, with the acknowledgement that I had limitations. And limitations, I was learning, weren't weakness. They were reality. The relationship question came up frequently in therapy. Dr. Park asking whether I was interested in dating again, whether isolation was protective or harmful. I'd avoided even thinking about relationships since the breakup that preceded the attempt. The idea of letting someone new into the wreckage of my life felt impossible. How do you explain to a potential partner that you're recovering from a suicide attempt? When do you disclose? First date? Third date? After they've invested enough that leaving feels cruel? Dr. Park suggested I wasn't ready, and I agreed. But in June, I matched with someone on a dating app, a woman named Rachel, who worked as a veterinary technician and loved hiking and photography. We texted for 2 weeks before meeting for coffee, and the conversation was easy in a way I hadn't experienced in years. She asked what I did for work, what I liked about Portland, what my hobbies were. Normal questions that I could answer honestly without revealing the full darkness. We went on 3 dates, coffee, then dinner, then a walk through Forest Park. On the 4th date, she asked why I'd been single for so long. I panicked and said I'd been dealing with health issues. She asked if I was okay now. I said I was managing. She touched my hand and said, "Whatever it is, you don't have to tell me yet, but I hope you will eventually." That gentleness undid me. I told her everything, the therapy lies, the planning, the attempt, the hospitalization, the ongoing treatment. I expected her to leave. She didn't. She asked questions. Good questions, specific questions about my safety plan and support system. Then she said, "I'm not scared of your past, but I need to know you're taking care of your present." I said I was. She believed me. We've been dating for 3 months now, and it's different than any relationship I've had before. She checks in without hovering, asks about my appointments without treating me like a patient, respects my boundaries around medication and therapy schedules. Last week, she met Danny and Claire and the girls. Emma asked her if she was going to be their new aunt. Rachel said, "Maybe someday." The possibility of someday existing beyond just my own survival felt revolutionary. Dr. Thompson started spacing out our appointments in July, moving from monthly to every 6 weeks. He explained that I demonstrated consistent stability, that my medication regimen was working, that the crisis phase had passed. The extension felt like both achievement and abandonment. I told Dr. Park about the anxiety of reduced psychiatric support, and he normalized it. "You've been in intensive care mode for a year. Stepping down feels scary because crisis management has been your baseline. We developed a plan for managing the gaps between psychiatry appointments, weekly therapy with Dr. Park, continued peer group attendance, daily medication logs, safety plan reviews, regular check-ins with Danny and Rachel. The structure helped. By August, the 6-week gaps felt manageable. I wasn't fixed, but I was stable. Stable was sustainable. Sustainable was success. The metrics of recovery had shifted from "am I better" to "am I maintaining?" And maintenance, I'd learned, was its own form of victory. Dr. Thompson told me during our August appointment that he'd been treating depression for 19 years, and my recovery trajectory was among the most dramatic he'd seen, not because the improvement was linear, but because I'd gone from sophisticated deception about wanting to die to sophisticated honesty about wanting to live. The compliment felt strange. I'd nearly destroyed myself and the people who loved me. But I'd also clawed my way back with help from professionals who believed recovery was possible even when I didn't. That counted for something. Maybe it counted for everything. The 1-year anniversary of the attempt came and went in late July without fanfare. I marked it privately by visiting Dr. Brennan at her new practice OR. She'd completed her additional training and returned to therapy with a specialization in suicide prevention. We met at her office, which looked similar to her old space but had different artwork and a newer desk. She asked how I was doing, and I gave her the honest update: stable on medication, consistent in therapy, managing work full-time, in a healthy relationship, attending peer support regularly, no serious suicidal ideation in 4 months. She smiled and said, "That's real recovery." I asked if she ever thought about our sessions, about the lies I'd told. She said she thought about them constantly, that I'd fundamentally changed how she assessed patients, how she documented sessions, how she listened for what people weren't saying. She showed me a training presentation she'd developed about high-functioning suicidal ideation, using my case as an anonymous example. The slides detailed the warning signs she'd missed, the assessment tools that had failed, the importance of collateral contacts with family members. Seeing my deception converted into educational material was surreal, but meaningful. If my near death could prevent someone else's actual death, the suffering had produced something beyond my own survival. Dr. Brennan asked if I was angry that she hadn't caught it. I told her what I'd told her before. I'd been actively preventing her from catching it. She couldn't have saved me from myself when I was that committed to dying invisibly, but she was saving others now by teaching them what to look for. That transformation, arc from therapist who'd missed the signs to educator who taught others not to miss them, was its own form of recovery. We talked for an hour, and when I left, she hugged me. Not a therapeutic, boundary-appropriate side hug, but a real, tight hug that said, "I'm glad you're alive." I hugged her back and meant it. If you enjoyed this, you will definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.